9,000 acres already lost, only 13% contained. And in the middle of America's largest wildfire, Trump's Border Patrol stormed a fire camp, forcing firefighters to stand down for 3 critical hours while 42 homes burned and 2 heroes were dragged away in handcuffs. The chamber shook as Jasmine Crockett faced him live before the nation, her fury slicing through the smoke like a blade. If those who save us can be treated as criminals, what fate awaits the rest of America? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The sky above Washington's Bear Gulch turned the color of blood. Smoke holed into the heavens, thick enough to choke out the sun, while the inferno below devoured everything in its path. More than 9,000 acres were already reduced to ash, and officials admitted with trembling voices that the fire was only 13% contained. Entire communities stood on the brink of annihilation. Families packed their cars with photo albums and pets, their eyes darting to the horizon where flames leapt higher than the tallest pines. Every breath tasted of smoke and fear. On the front lines, men and women in heavy gear battled the blaze with nothing but axes, shovels, and courage. Among them were firefighters from the tribes of Umatilla, Cayuse, and Walla Walla, descendants of people who had tended these lands for centuries, now fighting to save them from destruction. Their boots sank into scorched earth, their faces streaked with ash and sweat, and still they pressed forward, because that is what heroes do. Each second mattered. Each gallon of water poured was another home, another life, another history preserved. And then, out of nowhere, the unthinkable happened. A convoy of dark SUVs tore through the smoke, headlights slicing across the makeshift camp. Doors slammed, boots pounded the ground. Armed men in green uniforms stormed into the zone not to fight the flames, but to fight the very people holding the flames back. Guns raised, voices barked, "Line up, I diss out, now." The camp froze. Firefighters who had just come off the line, still coughing from smoke, were shoved aside and forced into formation like criminals. Radios crackled with confusion, helicopters roared above, and still the ICE agents barked orders as if this were a border raid instead of a battlefield against nature. One firefighter spat into the dirt, rage bowling through the exhaustion. His voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Are you f***ing crazy? We're saving lads." His words hung in the air, hotter than the fire itself, daring anyone to answer. But the agents didn't flinch, rifles stayed trained, eyes stayed cold. 2 men were pulled from the line, handcuffed before their brothers and sisters in gear, their helmets ripped away as though they were enemies of the state instead of defenders of the people. Around them, the wildfire surged forward, unchecked, as if mocking the madness unfolding in its shadow. For 3 long, wasted hours, the camp's work was paralyzed. Flames advanced, trees exploded into torches. Somewhere out there, homes fell and memories turned to dust. The firefighters clenched their fists, powerless to fight the fire while guns were pointed at their chests. Some whispered in disbelief, others cried silently, all of them knowing that precious time was slipping away. And watching from afar, America asked itself a single, terrifying question. Was the nation truly fighting the fire, or had it just chosen to burn itself alive? The smoke curled around the camp like a suffocating shroud as the Border Patrol agents tightened their grip. Radios were snatched away, phones seized, and when one firefighter dared to raise his camera, an agent shoved the lens downward and hissed, "Put that away, or you're next." The camp that had been a hive of urgency only moments ago, hoses laid out, gear stacked, men and women preparing to rotate shifts, was now silent, stripped of its purpose, its heartbeats stolen by fear and confusion. 2 firefighters were dragged from the line, their wrists bound in steel, their helmets clattering to the dirt like discarded shields. One cried out to his crew, "Tell my family I love them." But the words were cut short as a hand pushed his head down into the back of an SUV. His partner twisted desperately, begging for just a moment to embrace his brothers in arms. But the request was met with a snarl, "Shut your mouth and move." In that instant, every eye in the camp burned with helpless rage. Men who had walked willingly into walls of flame now stood powerless against the cold, unyielding steel of their own government. The scene fractured them. A young native firefighter, ash still smeared across his face, fell to his knees, clutching his helmet to his chest as tears carved tracks through the soot. Another slammed his fist into the dirt until his knuckles split, blood mixing with ash. From the tree line, the inferno pressed closer, a reminder that time was slipping, that lives outside this cap hung in the balance, yet the hands sworn to protect the border had chosen this battlefield here, against the very people defending their land from fire. When the news broke, it spread like wildfire itself. Photographs of exhausted firefighters standing in formation with rifles trained on them flashed across screens nationwide. Video clips leaked despite the threats, showing two men shoved into SUVs as their crews shouted, begged, wept. On one broadcast, the camera lingered on a young woman in heavy gear sobbing uncontrollably, her shoulders shaking as she whispered, "They ripped them away like criminals, not heroes." The footage ignited outrage. Across Washington and Oregon, vigils erupted. People lit candles, not just for the homes lost, but for the dignity stripped from those who had fought to save them. Local leaders slammed fists on podiums, demanding answers. How could armed raids take priority over fighting a fire that threatened thousands of lives? Families displaced by the flames asked bitterly why their safety had been gambled away for a spectacle of power. And in the heart of the confusion, one chilling question cut through the smoke and the fury, echoing louder than the fire engines, louder than the protests, louder even than the crackling inferno itself. Who gave this order, and why unleash it in the very moment America needed its heroes most? The images of firefighters in handcuffs spread faster than the flames themselves. By morning, the outrage had already reached the highest offices of the Pacific Northwest. Senator Patty Murray of Washington thundered on live television, her voice shaking with fury. In the middle of our state's worst wildfire, armed agents stormed a fire camp. This was not law enforcement. This was sabotage against our own people. Behind her, displaced families held signs reading "Firemen, not felons," and "Trump's raid cost U.S. homes." Cameras zoomed in on tear-streaked faces, on children clutching stuffed animals blackened by smoke, and suddenly, this was no longer just a fire, it was a national scandal. Washington's Attorney General Bob Ferguson stepped before the microphones. Next, his fist slamming against the podium. Every acre burned during those 3 wasted hours, every house reduced to ash, is on the heads of those who ordered this raid. We will investigate. We will hold them accountable. Across the border, Oregon Senator Ron Wyden echoed the sentiment, calling the raid a grotesque betrayal of trust and demanding to know why immigration agents were allowed to override common sense while fire devoured the land. The rhetoric was not careful, not measured, it was volcanic. The political dam had burst, and fury poured into the streets, but the counterattack came swiftly. Trump's allies seized the cameras and bellowed the same refrain. Law is law. They painted the detained firefighters not as heroes, but as illegals who exploited tragedy. The phrase echoed across right-wing media like a battle hymn. Conservative pundits declared, if they had no right to be here, then their actions mean nothing. The law must be enforced at all costs. On Fox Primetime, a host smirked as he asked, "Would you rather have a lawless country or a burning forest?" The implication was clear. You could not have both safety and compassion. You had to choose. The clash of narratives was electric. On one side, images of firefighters dragged away, their brothers weeping. On the other, the hammering chant of law and order. Social media became a war zone. Hashtags trended by the hour. Hashtag firefighters not ICE. Hashtag Trump the arsonist. Hashtag law or lives. Protests flared outside ICE field offices. Vigils lit up the steps of state capitals. The nation felt split down the middle, not between left and right, but between those who saw firefighters as saviors and those who saw them as suspects. It was against this backdrop that a new voice began to rise. Quiet at first, then louder, sharper, impossible to ignore. Representative Jasmine Crockett, a freshman Democrat from Texas, known for her firebrand speeches and unflinching defense of marginalized communities, was invited onto the national stage. Networks replayed her viral clip from a House floor debate where she once roared, "If justice is blind, then why do you keep handing her a gun and telling her who to shoot?" Now, leaders desperate for a figure who could channel the nation's fury looked to her. Plans were set in motion for a congressional hearing, broadcast live, where Crockett would confront Trump himself. The stakes could not be higher. Truth against spin, humanity against cruelty, fire against fire. And as the nation braced for the showdown, one question burned hotter than the flames still ravaging Washington. Could a single congresswoman bring down the man branded as America's political arsonist? The U.S. Capitol had never looked so much like an arena. Marble columns towered like silent judges, flags hung stiffly as if holding their breath, and the echo of shuffling feet sounded more like the prelude to a gladiator's match than a congressional hearing. For days the nation had seethed over images of firefighters in chains, and now every network camera was pointed at Washington. Anchors whispered like sportscasters before a heavyweight fight. Twitter feed spun with one refrain: Crockett versus Trump live. The air itself seemed to hum with anticipation, as though even the walls knew history was about to be scorched into them. Inside, the room was a pressure cooker. Rows of lawmakers filled their seats, faces set in hard lines, pens ready to recur every word, every slip, every blow. Reporters packed the press gallery, lenses glinting under the chandelier light, each one waiting to capture the shot that would define the moment. Beyond the velvet ropes, citizens who had lost their homes to Bear Gulch flames sat shoulder to shoulder with tribal elders, firefighters, and grieving families, their presence a silent indictment that made the air heavier than smoke. At the center sat Donald Trump, reclined in the witness chair like a man auditioning for his own coronation. His lips curled into that practiced smirk, his suit crisp, his eyes scanning the room as if daring anyone to strike him. To his supporters, he radiated defiance. To his critics, arrogance. But to the cameras, he looked like a man convinced he was untouchable. He leaned back, fingers laced, whispering something to his attorney that made them both chuckle. It was the laugh of someone who believed the outcome had already been written. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett entered with a slow, deliberate stride. She carried not just a stack of binders, but a weight that seemed to electrify the chamber. Inside those binders, leaked footage, sworn testimonies, signed affidavits, images too raw to ignore. She placed them on the desk with a thud that reverberated like a gavel, and for a moment the room was silent, as if the oxygen had been sucked away. Her eyes locked on Trump's, and neither looked away. The clash had not yet begun, but the sparks were already flying. The speaker's gavel struck once. Cameras zoomed closer. Millions of Americans leaned forward on couches, in diners, in firehouses, in shelters where smoke still seeped through the walls. Some cheered, some cursed, but all of them watched. For them, this wasn't just politics, it was survival. Would the man accused of turning heroes into fugitives walk away unscathed? Or would he finally face the flames of accountability? The lights blazed hotter, the tension coiled tighter, and as the first words prepared to ignite, one question gripped an entire nation. When the spotlight burns brightest, who will catch fire first, Trump, or the warrior who came to face him? The gavel struck, and before the echo faded, Jasmine Crockett was already on her feet. Her voice cut through the chamber like a siren tearing open the smoke. Only a madman would arrest firefighters fighting flames, and that madman is you. Gasps rippled across the rows of lawmakers, cameras zoomed, and the gallery erupted into murmurs that swelled like an approaching storm. Outside the Capitol, thousands gathered around giant screens roared approval, the chant of firefighters, not ice. Rising like thunder rolling against marble walls, Trump leaned back, a smirk slithering across his face. He let the silence hang just long enough to savor the spectacle, then delivered his line like a dagger wrapped in ice. They're illegals, not heroes. The words landed with the weight of a hammer, sending one side of the chamber into applause while the other side erupted in outrage. A Republican lawmaker banged the table in support. Across the aisle, a Democrat shouted back, "Tell that to the families whose homes they saved." The hearing devolved into a cacophony, the speaker's gavel pounding desperately against a storm that refused to quiet. Jasmine didn't wait. She leaned forward, eyes burning, her binder flipped open to reveal photographs firefighters coated in ash, dragging children out of collapsing homes, their faces lined with exhaustion, but lit with defiance. She held one up high for every camera to see. "This is who you call criminals," she demanded, her voice cracking with raw fury. "These men and women were choking on smoke, while you were choking on your own lies. They didn't ask if the families were citizens, they just saved them." The gallery exploded in applause. Trump shifted in his chair, but the smirk clung stubbornly to his face. He jabbed a finger across the chamber. "You don't protect America by ignoring the law. You don't save this country by letting illegals infiltrate it. That's why I'm here and why you." Jasmine slammed her palm on the desk, cutting him off mid-sentence. "No, Mr. Trump, that's why you're here, because your obsession with cruelty cost this nation 3 hours of firefighting, 42 homes, and God knows how many lives." You didn't save America. You burned it." Her words reverberated through the chamber like the crack of a whip. Outside, the crowd surged, their chants rattling windows. Shame, shame, shame. Inside, the hearing had become less a proceeding than a political brawl broadcast in real time. Lawmakers shouted over one another, microphones hissed with feedback, and the air felt charged, alive, perilous. It wasn't law, it wasn't order, it was war, waged not with bullets but with words sharper than blades. Every exchange was another punch, every rebuttal another swing. This was no longer testimony, it was a prize fight, staged before an audience of millions. And as the cameras closed in on Trump's tightened jaw and Jasmine's clenched fists, the nation leaned forward in rapt silence, asking the same breathless question. Was this just the opening round, or were Americans about to witness a knockout blow before the fight had even begun? Outside the chamber, America erupted like dry timber catching a spark. Within minutes of the first exchange, hashtags streaked across every screen. Hashtag Firefighters not ice. Hashtag Trump the arsonist. Hashtag Law or Lies. TikTok filled with split screens. On one side, the fire raging across Washington. On the other, Trump's smirk as Jasmine's voice thundered. On Twitter, firefighters from across the country posted photos of themselves in sustained gear holding signs. "We fight flames, not politics." The nation was no longer a spectator. It was a chorus of fury, grief, and disbelief. Reporters swarmed evacuation shelters, thrusting microphones toward the displaced. A mother of three stood before the camera, her voice trembling as she held her child's singed teddy bear. "My house is gone. The fire didn't ask if I was a citizen before it burned everything I owned. That the people who saved us, they were firefighters, heroes, and they were treated like criminals. How can anyone defend that?" Her words struck harder than any politician's speech, ricocheting through living rooms and news feeds, igniting empathy in millions. Elsewhere, a retired firefighter broke down live on air, his calloused hands covering his face. Tears spilled through his fingers as he choked out, "I wore that uniform for 30 years. We don't ask who you voted for or where you were born. We just pull you out of the flames. To see them in handcuffs, we are not criminals. We never were." His sobs silenced the studio, the anchor barely holding composure as the clip went viral within minutes. Yet Trump, inside the hearing room, remained unshaken. Leaning into the microphone, he scoffed at Jasmine's accusations. "This is a circus, and she's nothing but a puppet of the Democrats," he declared, gesturing dismissively toward her. His allies chuckled, some pounding their desks in agreement. To them, the anger outside was noise, not a reckoning. The man at the center of the storm still believed himself untouchable. The divide only deepened. Trump supporters filled their own feeds with slogans. Hashtag Law is Law. Hashtag No Illegals in Uniform. Right-wing talk shows mocked Jasmine as performative, accusing her of crying for illegals while Americans lose their homes, but every insult only seemed to harden the lines. The country wasn't just watching a hearing. It was picking sides in real time. Back inside the Capitol, Jasmine didn't flinch. She sat still, letting the nose settle, her hand resting on the thick binder before her. Around her, the chamber buzzed with tension, cameras zooming in on her, face calm, collected, almost surgical in its focus. Trump had tried to dismiss her with a smirk, with a word meant to reduce her to nothing. But Jasmine Crockett was not built to be dismissed, and as the chants outside rattled, the windows and millions online demanded justice with every keystroke. The question grew heavier, sharper, impossible to ignore. How would Jasmine strike back to flip the script and set the entire chamber on fire? The speaker called the first witness, and the chamber shifted from heated rhetoric to a silence so sharp it could cut. A firefighter stepped forward, his gear still streaked with soot, his face carved by exhaustion and defiance. He adjusted the microphone with shaking hands, then raised his eyes to the rows of lawmakers and the millions watching. His voice was steady, but each word landed like a blow. "They pointed guns at us while flames ate the trees." A gasp rippled across the gallery, a sound caught between disbelief and fury. Behind him, images flashed onto the screen walls, of fire devouring the forest while men in uniform corralled exhausted firefighters into lines. He continued, his words raw, stripped of polish. "We were choking on smoke, carrying people out of burning homes, and they lined us up like criminals. Do you know what it feels like to fight fire with one hand and be shackled by your own government with the other? It feels like betrayal. It feels like someone chose politics over human life. The room swayed under the weight of his testimony. Even hardened lawmakers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, their eyes lowered. Then came the youngest witness, barely out of his 20s, a native firefighter from the Umatilla tribe. His voice cracked as he spoke, his uniform hanging loosely on a frame that had grown thin from weeks on the line. "We risked our lives, and ICE treated us worse than criminals. They told us not to film, not to speak, not to resist. But we were there to save lives, not to hide ours. When they dragged my brothers away, I thought maybe America didn't want us after all." His hands trembled, but his words stabbed with a precision no politician could match. By the time he finished, the chamber wasn't just silent, it was breaking. A woman in the gallery sobbed openly, covering her mouth. A lawmaker dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, another clenched his fists so tight his knuckles blanched. The camera zoomed in on Jasmine Crockett, her jaw tight, eyes glistening but unyielding, as though every syllable from the witnesses was fuel she would soon unleash. Trump shifted in his seat, arms crossed, face a mask of irritation, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. His smirk had faltered, if only for a moment. The speaker thanked the witnesses, but their words hung heavy, vibrating in the air like the echo of church bells after a funeral. These weren't policy debates or partisan slogans, they were truths pulled from fire and blood, truths too searing to ignore. And as America absorbed the testimonies, one question blazed hotter than the inferno itself. Could words born in the flames tear down the towering walls of lies built to contain them? The witnesses stepped down, their words still echoing in the chamber like smoke clinging to burned timber. For a moment, silence gripped the room, until a chair scraped back and Senator Patty Murray rose from her seat. She didn't shout, she didn't need to. Her voice was measured, deliberate, and every syllable cut with precision. "What we heard today is not just testimony, it is an indictment." Firefighters begged for the chance to fight the flames, but instead they were forced to fight their own government. Mr. Trump did not choose protection. He chose persecution. He chose deportation over salvation. The gallery erupted in applause, the sound rolling through the chamber like a wave breaking against stone. Cameras zoomed in on Trump, his jaw tight, his smile thinning into something far less certain. Next came Washington's Attorney General Bob Ferguson, his tone sharper, angrier, the voice of a man who had seen too many families displaced, too many homes turned to ash. He slammed a folder of burned photographs onto the desk in front of him, images of charred houses, blackened cribs, smoldering remains of what had once been lives. "These," he thundered, "are the casualties of 3 wasted hours, every acre lost, every home destroyed, while Border Patrol staged its theater. This belongs to Trump's America. Law is meaningless if it is wielded like a weapon against the very people keeping us alive." His words landed like hammer blows, driving the chamber deeper into fury. Then came Ron Wyden, the Oregon senator, whose voice shook not from weakness, but from rage tightly restrained. He pointed directly at Trump, his finger trembling with controlled fury. "You let ICE terrorize our firefighters, all our forests burned. You abandoned the oaths of office, you abandoned the people. History will not remember this as law and order, it will remember it as cowardice and cruelty." The crowd outside, listening on giant screens, roared in approval, their chants swelling. "Firefighters, not ICE. Firefighters, not ICE." The sound rattled the very glass panes of the Capitol. Trump snapped. He leaned forward, face flushed, pounding the table with both fists. His voice broke through the chamber like a wild animal cornered. "Lies, fake news, every word out of your mouths is a lie. This is nothing but a witch hunt, another disgraceful attempt to smear me." His shout echoed so loudly the microphone screeched with feedback, but the fury in his tone betrayed something deeper than defiance. It betrayed fear. The cameras caught every bead of sweat, every twitch of his jaw. For the first time, the man who had strutted into the chamber as if untouchable looked shaken. Jasmine watched silently, her eyes sharp as blades, her silence louder than any speech. She didn't need to strike yet. Her allies had drawn the blood, and as Trump's fist thundered against the table, one thought seized the millions watching across America. When a beast is driven into a corner, will it retreat or will it bare its fangs and strike back with something even more dangerous? The chamber trembled with voices clashing like steel, until Trump raised his hand and leaned toward the microphone. His voice, gravelly yet commanding, sliced through the chaos. "No one is above the law." He paused, letting the words hang in the air as if they were scripture, his eyes sweeping the room with practiced authority. Not me. Not you. Not the so-called heroes outside. If they broke the law, they pay the price. That's how America survives. Without law and order, we are nothing. Applause erupted from his allies, a chorus of fists pounding desks in rhythm with his words. Cameras flashed, and for a moment, it felt as though Trump had reclaimed the stage, wrapping himself in the familiar armor of defiance. But Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She rose slowly, the weight of the binders before her symbolic of more than evidence. It was the weight of truth itself. Her voice carried the precision of a blade, every syllable sharpened to draw blood. No one is above the law. Then why did you burn the law when it suited you? 30 for felony convictions say otherwise. She hurled the number like a grenade into the chamber, and the explosion was instant. Gasps ripped through the air. The press gallery erupted in a frenzy of scribbling pens and flashing cameras, and outside the building the crowd howled like a storm tearing through the streets. Trump froze, the mask cracking, his smirk replaced with a twitch of disbelief. His lips parted as if to fire back, but nothing came. The number 34 hung above him like smoke too thick to escape, suffocating the very argument he had clung to. Jasmine didn't relent. She stepped closer, binder in hand, and her words thundered. You lecture us on law while your own record drips with crime. You weaponize the law against firefighters saving lives, but when it turned against you, suddenly you were the victim, Mr. Trump. The only thing you've ever fought to save is yourself. The chamber was electric. One side erupted in cheers, lawmakers rising to their feet, fists pumping the air, while the other side shouted over them, their cries drowned in the roar. The speaker's gavel pounded again and again, but the sound was lost in the storm. Millions watching at home leaned closer to their screens, unable to look away from the spectacle unfolding. Trump slammed his hand on the desk, snarling, "Witch hunt, corrupt courts, rigged system." His voice cracked, the desperation bleeding through, but Jasmine simply stood, still and unyielding, letting his rage burn itself hollow. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the contrast, one figure unraveling, the other standing tall, calm, relentless, and as the room quaked under the weight of her words, a single question ignited in the minds of every American watching. Who is truly the criminal here, the firefighters in chains, or the man drowning in his own convictions? The sting of Jasmine's words still hung in the chamber when Trump lurched forward, his face crimson, his voice a guttural snarl. You're nothing but a loudmouth puppet, he spat, jabbing a finger across the table. A nobody propped up by Democrats who need someone to scream their lies for them. You don't know the first thing about leadership, about sacrifice. You've never built anything in your life except cheap theatrics. His voice cracked like a whip, meant to humiliate, meant to break. Gasps filled the room. Some Republican allies clapped their hands against the desk, jeering, while others leaned forward, eyes glittering with the thrill of blood in the water. Cameras flashed furiously, hungry for the perfect shot. The former president unleashing his venom, the congresswoman sitting across from him like prey caught in a predator's glare. For a moment, it looked as though the air itself would shatter under the weight of his rage. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Instead, a smile, small, deliberate, dangerous, curled at the corner of her mouth. It wasn't the smile of someone cowed. It was the smile of someone who had seen the punch coming from a mile away and was already winding up for the counterstrike. Her silence was louder than his outbursts, her stillness more cutting than his insults. Trump's tirade echoed, then faltered, as if his fury had been swallowed whole, at the unshaken figure staring back at him. The crowd outside reacted instantly. Screens replayed his words, loudmouth puppet, and the hashtags multiply. Some mocked him, others fumed, but everyone was watching. Inside, the contrast was blinding. Trump's face contorted with rage, veins straining at his temples, while Jasmine sat calm, posed, her binder unopened but already lethal. The imbalance told its own story, one man unraveling, one woman sharpening, reporters scribbled furiously. A CNN anchor whispered into a live mic, "This isn't testimony anymore. This is bare-knuckle combat." A Fox commentator smirked, calling it Trump at his best. That the split screens told another tale. Half the nation saw a man clawing to survive. The other half saw a leader cornered, desperate, and losing ground. Trump tried again, piling insult on insult. You're a disgrace. You're weak. You don't belong in this chamber. You belong on a street corner with a megaphone. screaming nonsense no one listens to. His words dripped with venom, but they fell like stones into water loud at first, then swallowed whole by the calm, steady silence across the table. Jasmine's eyes never left his, and that unbroken stare was cutting him deeper than any speech could. The chamber waited, breathless, on the edge of explosion. Was she going to stay silent, let him seethe in the emptiness of his own fury, or would she rise and turn his words into the very weapon that ended him? And as the cameras zoomed tighter, capturing the smirk tugging at her lips, a single question electrified the air. Would Jasmine Crockett let the insult die, is silence, or unleash the counterstrike that could set the chamber ablaze? Jasmine rose slowly, the weight of the room shifting with her every step. The chamber fell into a hush, anticipation thick as smoke before a backdraft. She carried nothing but a single photograph in her hand, yet it seemed heavier than any binder, heavier even than the gavel that commanded the hearing. She stopped just a few feet from Trump, turned the photograph outward, and raised her voice so the nation could hear. This is America. These are heroes, and you made them fear guns more than flames. The image on the screen behind her exploded into view, a firefighter cradling a soot-stained child, tears streaming down his ash-smeared face, the inferno roaring in the background. Gasps ricocheted across the gallery. Lawmakers leaned forward in stunned silence, and outside, the crowd watching on giant screens erupted with chants so loud they rattled a marble of the Capitol itself. Inside, the chamber detonated into applause, the sound cascading like thunder rolling through a canyon. Even those who had sat stoic, refusing to take sides, found themselves caught in the wave, their hands clapping almost in defiance of their own restraint. Trump's jaw clenched. He stared at the photograph as if it were a weapon pointed directly at him. His lips parted, but no words came. The cameras zoomed closer, capturing every twitch of his face, every bead of sweat forming along his brow. 30 seconds passed, then 35, then 37. The silence grew unbearable, louder than any scream, heavier than any accusation. A man who built his career on words, on bluster, on domination, reduced to nothing by a single picture and a single sentence. Jasmine stood unwavering, her eyes never leaving his. She didn't need to add more. The silence was her ally, stretching across the chamber like a rope tightening around his throat. Millions of viewers across the nation leaned toward their screens, their hearts pounding, sensing history crystallizing in real time. Pundits in studios sat slack-jawed. Reporters in press boxes scribbled furiously, yet no one dared to break the spell. For once, Donald Trump, the man who never stopped talking, was speechless. The moment seared itself into memory. Some would later call it Jasmine's finest strike, others would call it the precise second Trump's armor cracked. But in that chamber, in that silence, all anyone could think was that the tide had shifted. Applause swelled again, longer, louder, like a standing ovation that refused to die down. Jasmine lowered the photograph, turned, and walked back to her seat as if she had just delivered not a blow, but a verdict. And as the roar of approval filled the Capitol, one question pulsed through the veins of every American watching. Was this silence the death knell of Trump's power, or the opening tremor of something even more explosive yet to come? The silence inside the Capitol shattered into noise outside its walls. By the time Jasmine returned to her seat, the chants beyond the barricades had swelled into a roar shaking the city itself. Firefighters, not ICE. Firefighters, not ICE. Thousands of voices blended into one, echoing down Pennsylvania Avenue like a drumbeat of defiance. Protesters held up scorched helmets, photographs of burned homes, and signs scrawled in thick black ink. Trump lit the match. The air smelled of smoke, not from wildfire, but from the flares and candles that blanketed the streets in a haze of rebellion. News helicopters hovered above, cameras capturing a tidal wave of humanity flooding the intersections. Firefighters from across the nation, active and retired, stood shoulder to shoulder with students, parents, veterans. Some wore turnout gear streaked with soot, others carried axes as symbols, not weapons. A sea of raised fists rose into the night, a warning to those who dared dismiss them. In Los Angeles, in Chicago, in New York, the same chant erupted as if the entire country had synchronized into one defiant chorus. The movement was no longer local, it was national. Commentators scrambled to name what they were witnessing. On cable news, one analyst blurted out what millions already whispered online: Trump isn't commander-in-chief. He's fire-starter-in-chief. The phrase stuck, plastered across headlines within hours. Memes spread like sparks in dry grass, showing Trump's face imposed over flames, captions screaming, "He didn't stop the fire, he fueled it." Hashtags multiply, and so did the crowds. What had started as anger over a ray was mutating into something larger, something more volatile, a reckoning that would not be contained by tear gas or curfews. And then came the foreign press. London's Guardian splashed the headline, "America at war with itself." Al Jazeera broadcast scenes of protesters clashing with riot police in Seattle, framing it as a nation tearing apart under its own contradictions. In Berlin, a commentator shook his head on live TV. "They handcuff firefighters, or their country burns." What is left of the American ideal? The world was no longer watching from a distance, it was diagnosing an empire in flames. Back in Washington, a young protester climbed a lamppost and unfurled a banner bearing Jasmine Crockett's words, "Heroes don't need papers to save lives." The crowd roared in approval. Police sirens wailed, but the chants drowned them out. Inside the Capitol, even lawmakers could hear the pounding rhythm outside, a reminder that this was no longer a hearing, it was a battle being fought on every street corner in America. The night glowed with firelight, from candles and clashes alike, and millions asked themselves a question too dangerous to ignore. Was this uprising just smoke destined to fade, or the spark of a blaze that would consume the entire nation? The morning after the hearing, America woke up not to weather reports or market updates, but to a political earthquake replaying on every screen. CNN opened with a slow-motion montage of Trump's face as Jasmine held up the photograph of the firefighter and child, then froze on the exact second he fell silent. A booming narrator's voice declared, 37 seconds, the silence heard around the world. Analysts filled the panels, some wide-eyed, some grim, but all unanimous. This was no ordinary exchange. It was a rupture. On MSNBC, the headline blazed across the ticker, "Turning Point. Trump silenced in historic hearing." Pundits dissected Jasmine's words frame by frame, calling her delivery surgical, devastating, and the most viral moment of the election season. Clips of her line, "You made them fear guns more than flames," looped endlessly, paired with video of firefighters in chains, creating a contrast so sharp it pierced straight into the national psyche. One commentator leaned into the camera and whispered, as if confiding with millions, "That was not a hearing. That was a trial, and America was the jury." Fox News, scrambling to contain the damage, tried to spin the silence into strategy. A host insisted the president didn't answer because he didn't dignify the circus with a response, but the footage betrayed them. The camera had lingered mercilessly on his frozen expression, on the twitch of his jaw, on the sweat glistening at his temple. Even some conservative commentators admitted, reluctantly, that the optics were brutal. One muttered on air, "Whatever you call it, it didn't look like strength." Social media turned the moment into a weapon. Hashtags trended in capital letters, hashtag Trump frozen, hashtag 37 seconds, hashtag Crockett Co. Memes flooded timelines, Trump's blank stare photoshopped into movie posters with titles like "The Silence of the Strong Man" and "Gone in 37 seconds." TikTok stitched Jasmine's line into rap beats, into football highlight reels, into fiery montages that racked up millions of views within hours. For the first time in years, Trump wasn't the one dictating the narrative, he was the punchline of it. Political analysts moved quickly to frame the stakes. The New York Times ran an op-ed calling the hearing the most pivotal moment of the campaign trail without being on the trail. The Washington Post splashed a headline, "Turning Point. The day Trump lost the room." Pollsters whispered that swing voters had been rattled, that suburban families watching the hearing saw not a commander, but a cornered man, stripped of his bravado. Every outlet, left or right, conceded one fact: Jasmine Crockett had changed the calculus. And yet, as pundits filled the air with predictions, one question hovered above the frenzy like smoke refusing to clear. Was this Jasmine's killing blow, or just the spark that would drive Trump into even more dangerous, desperate territory? By dawn, her face was everywhere. Not just on news channels dissecting every frame of the hearing, but on murals hastily painted on plywood walls in Portland, on protest banners waving in the smoke-filled streets of Seattle, on digital billboards flashing above Times Square. To millions of Americans, Jasmine Crockett was no longer just the congresswoman from Texas. She had become the voice of firefighters, the defender of the people. Anchors spoke her name with the gravity of history. Activists whispered it like a rallying cry. The clip of her holding up the photograph and declaring, "This is America. These are heroes. And you made them fear guns more than flames," became the most shared video in the country. Within 24 hours, it hit 50 million views, crossing platforms, looping on TikTok edits, being remixed into protest songs, even projected onto the side of buildings during late-night demonstrations. For younger generations, she was a symbol of courage in a cynical age. For older Americans, she was a reminder of leaders who once stood unflinching in the face of injustice. Her words resonated because they cut deeper than politics. They cut into identity, into what it meant to call someone a hero. Minority communities embraced her with unrestrained pride. Tribal elders from the Umatilla and Cayuse sent her a hand-woven blanket, draped across her shoulders at a rally where chants shook the air. Jasmine. 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 Immigrant groups, long vilified in rhetoric, now saw her as proof that someone in power was willing to bleed for their dignity. Civil rights leaders compared her to Fannie Lou Hamer and Barbara Jordan, women who had once dared to confront the machinery of power and survived. The language was lofty, the comparisons monumental, but the emotion behind them was raw, real, undeniable. At the same time, she became a lightning rod. Right-wing commentators attacked her relentlessly, painting her as anti-law, reckless, dangerous. One pundit sneered, "She's an actress, not a leader." But even in their venom, they revealed her impact. No one was neutral anymore. Jasmine had split the country's attention in two, and she had forced her name into the bloodstream of American politics. Every insult hurled at her only multiplied her visibility, and every attempt to discredit her only hardened the loyalty of those who saw her as the warrior they had been waiting for. In the corridors of Washington, whispers began to ripple. Could this woman, once dismissed as a freshman firebrand, become a kingmaker or even more? Strategists scribbled numbers on whiteboards, watching polls shift in real time. Donors opened wallets, organizers knocked on doors with her quotes printed on flyers. She wasn't running for anything yet, but power was gathering around her like dry timber around a spark. And as the chants of her name bled from the streets into the halls of Congress, one question echoed with the force of prophecy. Could a single warrior, armed with nothing but truth and fire, shift the balance of power in America itself? Behind closed doors, the mood was nothing like the bravado Trump had tried to display in public. Inside a dimly lit conference room at his private club, curtains drawn tight, the former president sat hunched over a long mahogany table, surrounded by his most loyal lieutenants. J.D. Vance leaned forward, his hands steepled, voice low but urgent. "She's outflanking us. The silence clip is everywhere. If we don't hit back hard," she defined this entire narrative. Stephen Miller slammed a folder onto the table, his words sharper, more venomous. "Then we paint her for what she is: anti-American, weak on security, a mouthpiece for criminals. We turn her into the threat." Trump's face was a storm, shifting between rage and unease. He slammed his fist against the table, rattling glasses of water. "No one humiliates me. No one. She's nothing, a nobody. We'll crush her." His voice cracked with fury, but in the pauses, the weight of desperation hung heavy. The man who once commanded rooms with ease was now trapped, strategizing not from dominance, but from defense. They outlined attack lines with ruthless efficiency. Conservative media would brand Jasmine the chaos candidate, accuse her of caring more about illegal immigrants than American families. Vance suggested sound bites. "She'd rather defend outsiders than protect you," Miller sneered. "We'll call her the puppet of radicals, a danger to security. Weak on borders, weak on law, weak on America." They nodded grimly, knowing the script well. It was the same old playbook, recycled and sharpened for a new target. But outside their insulated walls, the tide was shifting. Polls showed suburban families sympathizing not with Trump's law and order mantra, but with the firefighters in chains. Veterans posted viral videos condemning the raid, saying they fought overseas for freedom only to see their fellow citizens treated like enemies at home. Even some conservative voters muttered uneasily that Trump's silence had been a bad look. His fury unhinged. The more his allies smeared Jasmine, the more her supporters multiply. What was meant to discredit her instead made her larger, louder, untouchable. In that room, however, the panic was disguised as bravado. Trump raged on, calling Jasmine a loudmouth fraud and vowing revenge. Yet every outburst betrayed what his smirk in public tried to conceal: fear. For the first time, he wasn't controlling the firestorm, he was consumed by it. He knew it, and so did the men beside him, though none dared to say it aloud. As midnight bled into morning, their strategy hardened into one brutal question: if smears and spin failed, would Trump double down with something darker, more reckless, more dangerous than words? Because when a beast is wounded, cornered, stripped of its roar, the choice becomes inevitable. Does it limp away to die or bare its fangs and lunge for blood? The cameras left the marble halls of Congress and turned to the scorched neighborhoods of Washington, where the fire had left nothing but blackened skeletons of homes. Piles of twisted metal and ash marked where families once gathered for dinners, birthdays, and Christmas mornings. In the wreckage, survivors stood like ghosts wandering through their own memories, clutching what little they had salvaged: a scorched photograph, a melted locket, a child's toy charred at the edges. Reporters waded into this devastation, microphones trembling in hands as they captured voices raw, harsher, more human than any political speech. An elderly woman, her hair streaked with soot, clung to a blanket draped over her shoulders. Her voice cracked as she spoke into the camera. "Firefighters saved me. Trump betrayed me." She recounted how two young men had carried her out as her roof collapsed, their faces masked by smoke, their arms trembling but steady. "They didn't ask where I came from, who I was, they just saved me. And then your government, our government, put them in chains. How do you explain that?" Her words struck like thunder across airwaves, shared millions of times within hours. Nearby, a father stood beside the ruins of what used to be his children's bedrooms. He held up a fragment of a scorched bed frame, his face twisted with fury. "We lost everything. And while we begged for help, Trump's ICE was busy arresting the very people holding the fire back. What kind of leader does that?" His voice broke, not just in grief but in rage, and the silence that followed was more haunting than his outcry. Then came the voice of a retired firefighter, eyes red, jaw trembling as he forced the words out. "I spent 30 years running into fires. You never stop to ask who's legal or not, you just go. Because every second means a life. To see those kids treated like criminals, it made me feel like everything I ever stood for was betrayed." The weight of his confession spread like shockwaves, drawing tears from Anka's live on air. The testimonies piled one atop another, forming a chorus that no politician could mute. It was not strategy, not spin, not punditry, it was grief and fury, unfiltered, undeniable. And as the nation listened, a truth seared itself into the conscience of millions. When the hearts of ordinary Americans are cracked open by loss, can politics dare remain still? Or will the tremor force the ground beneath Washington to finally break? The chamber was still echoing with the voices of survivors when Jasmine Crockett rose to speak again. She didn't shout, she didn't need to. Her voice cut through the air with the clarity of a blade drawn in silence. She looked around the room at allies, at enemies, at Trump himself, and asked the question that seemed to freeze time. Do we want a nation ruled by fear, or a nation saved by courage? The words landed like thunderclaps. The air in the Capitol thickened, so heavy that even the sound of breathing seemed too loud. Lawmakers who had spent hours sparring and shouting now sat pinned to their seats, unable to look away. The cameras zoomed in on Trump, but for once, he wasn't the center. Every lens, every eye, every heartbeat was locked on Jasmine. The silence that followed her question wasn't empty, it was charged, like the breath before an explosion. Then something happened no one expected. A Republican congressman, his tie loosened, his face pale from hours of watching the testimony, shifted in his seat. At first he only lowered his eyes, as if trying to escape the weight of her words. But then he pushed back his chair and slowly stood. For a long moment, no one understood what he was doing, and then he clapped. One sharp sound, cracking against the silence like a gunshot, then another, then another. The chamber erupted. Democrats rose first, then independents, then more Republicans followed, some reluctantly, some defiantly, until the entire room was on its feet. Applause roared through the hall, crashing like waves against the marble, drowning out even the pounding gavel of the speaker. Outside, the crowd heard the eruption and answered with chants of Jasmine's words, the sound rippling down avenues like a shockwave. Trump sat rigid, fists clenched on the table, his face a mask of barely restrained rage. But the cameras didn't linger on him, they lingered on Jasmine, standing tall in the storm she had unleashed, her question echoing in the minds of millions. And as the clapping grew louder, Unstoppable, the country confronted a question it could no longer dodge. Was this the moment America broke free from its chains of fear, or merely the fragile crack before the real fracture of its politics? Trump did not retreat, he struck back with fury. Days after the hearing, he stood on a stage draped in red, white, and blue, bathed in spotlights that cast his shadow tall and menacing across the crowd. His voice thundered through the speakers, each word sharpened into a blade. Jasmine Crockett is not a hero, she is a traitor. The crowd erupted in chants of traitor, traitor, as he jabbed his finger into the air, painting her as the enemy of America, the face of everything they fear. His words dripped venom, but beneath the roar of approval, something darker simmered, the sense of a country tearing further apart. Outside the rallies, America's streets became battlegrounds. Supporters and protesters clashed under banners and burning torches, fists swinging, flags torn from hands and trampled into the pavement. In Portland, police lines barely contained the chaos as chants of firefighters, not ICE, collided with law and order now. In Dallas, rival groups stood nose to nose, the air electric, one side holding Jasmine's words on posters, the other waving MAGA flags like weapons. Helicopter spotlights circled overhead, cutting through smoke from flares and bonfires lit in defiance. Cable news split screens captured the war of images. Trump grinning on stage as crowds screamed his name. Jasmine's speeches replay over footage of firefighters embraced by survivors. Protesters bleeding in the streets, while anchors asked if this was the breaking point of a divided nation. Hashtags clashed online like soldiers in trenches. Hashtag Crockett the warrior trending alongside hashtag traitor Crockett. Every post, every clip, every confrontation fed the storm, tightening the coil of tension until the country itself felt like a wire pulled taut. In Washington, Jasmine watched it unfold with a face carved from stone. She had known her words would ignite fire, but even she could not deny how fast the blaze was spreading. Trump had chosen to escalate, to weaponize fear, and the nation was now holding its breath. And as the cameras captured fists raised, flames glowing, and chants battling for dominance, one question gnawed at the heart of America. Would this taut string finally snap and plunge the nation into chaos, or could it, against all odds, be tuned into the first note of a new harmony? The chamber had become a furnace of history, and Jasmine Crockett stood at its center. Before her lay the binders swollen with testimony, photographs, timelines, sworn statements, an arsenal of truth that had been built piece by piece through fire and fury. She placed her hand atop the stack and spoke with a voice steady as steel. We have heard the witnesses, we have seen the evidence. Firefighters were saving lives while armed men treated them as criminals. This was not law, this was not order, this was betrayal. Her words rang like a verdict, echoing off marble and glass, impossible to escape. Screens lit up behind her. Images of firefighters hauling children through smoke, recordings of tearful survivors, stills of two men in handcuffs with flames raging in the distance. Every piece landed like a hammer blow. She turned to Trump, her eyes unflinching. You silenced yourself when the truth was shown. And today, America sees it clearly. The danger was never the firefighters, it was you. Gasps rippled through the gallery, reporters' pens racing to catch every syllable, cameras closing in on Trump's paling face. Trump slammed both fists on the table, his voice breaking into a hoarse roar. Witch hunt? Lies. She's twisting everything. Everything. I saved this country, you have nothing without me. But the fury fell flat. His shouts echo in the cavernous room only to dissolve into emptiness. No applause followed, no chance of support, just silence, punctuated by the scratching of pens and the blinking of cameras. For the first time, his voice sounded small, swallowed by the enormity of what surrounded him. Jasmine didn't answer with anger, she answered with silence, letting his words collapse under their own weight. When she finally spoke, it was calm, final, devastating. History will remember what happened here, not by the nose, but by the truth. And the truth is this: heroes fought fire while you chose to fight them. That is your legacy. Her tone carried no triumph, only the certainty of judgment already past. And as the chamber bristled with the aftershocks of her final strike, the nation itself leaned forward, breath held, hearts pounding with a single haunting question. When the smoke clears, who will emerge from the ashes, an enduring hero or a fallen villain? The chamber was still vibrating from the clash when Jasmine rose one final time. The binders of evidence lay closed before her, but she didn't touch them. She didn't need paper or photographs, now only her voice. The hall seemed to shrink around her, every camera, every eye fixed on the figure who had turned a hearing into a reckoning. She drew a breath, let the silence linger, and spoke with the clarity of a bell ringing in smoke. No president above the law, no firefighter below dignity. The words cut through the air with the force of a hammer striking stone. For a moment, no one moved. Then, like a wave crashing against a cliff, the entire chamber surged to its feet. Lawmakers who had been divided for hours now rose in unison, their applause thunderous, relentless, unstoppable. The gallery joined them, survivors and families crying openly, some embracing strangers beside them. Cameras caught tears glistening down hardened faces, even among lawmakers who had sworn never to cross partisan lines. The sound carried beyond the walls of Congress. Outside, the crowd erupted as Jasmine's words blasted through speakers. Protesters who had chanted through tear gas now raised their fists with pride, repeating her line as if it were scripture. Across America, televisions echoed the moment. Families in diners stopped eating to watch. Firefighters in stations stood in silence. Churches rang bells, and for one heartbeat, the country seemed united by a sentence carved out of truth. Trump sat rigid, lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes darting as the ovation grew. His fists clenched, but he could not rise, could not speak, could not steal back the air that Jasmine had claimed. He was a man left behind in a storm he could no longer control. She had not just defeated his argument, she had taken the ground from beneath his feet. And as the cheers refused to die, echoing like a chorus carried across the nation, one question pressed itself into the conscience of every American watching. After this moment, after this shock, would the United States dare to change or retreat back into the silence that had almost burned it alive? The doors of Congress swung open, and Jasmine Crockett emerged into the blinding wash of cameras and sunlight. The roar outside was deafening. Thousands who had waited for hours surged forward, their chants shaking the marble steps. Jasmine! 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 She did not wave or bask in the moment. Instead, she descended the steps slowly, deliberately, her eyes searching until they found the men in soot-stained uniforms, the firefighters who had become the heart of this struggle. One of them, his hands still scarred from the blaze, stepped forward. For a second, the crowd hushed as Jasmine reached out and clasped his hand. Cameras captured it from every angle, the congresswoman who had stood against a president, binding herself not to power, but to the people who had carried children out of fire. In that moment, the cheers returned like thunder, spilling into every corner of the plaza, echoing into the streets beyond. People wept openly, strangers embracing, as if some invisible weight had finally lifted. Reporters jostled for the perfect shot, Jasmine shaking hands with survivors, kneeling to hug a child who clutched her soot-marked teddy bear, nodding gravely to tribal elders who placed their hands on her shoulders, a blessing. It was not the pomp of politics, it was the solemn triumph of humanity. The chants grew louder, until they were less a crowd and more a chorus, a living testament to what had just unfolded inside. Behind her, the Capitol loomed, an institution scarred by division, but for one fleeting moment lit by the possibility of something more. On screens across America, a message burned into view in stark, white letters over black. Justice belongs to the people. It lingered there, a reminder and a warning, impossible to ignore. And then came the final question, appearing not as narration, but as a challenge hurled directly into the hearts of millions watching. If heroes were arrested while saving your community, would you stay silent or fight back? The screen cut to black. The applause still rang in the ears of those watching. And across the nation, in living rooms, in firehouses, in shelters, Americans sat in stunned silence, knowing this story was no longer just about Jasmine Crockett or Donald Trump. It was about them, about their courage, about whether they would rise when the flames came for their own homes. In the end, the story of Jasmine Crockett versus Trump is not just about politics, it is about the kind of nation we choose to be. When firefighters risked their lives, they didn't ask who was legal or worthy. They simply saved. True courage is measured not by power, but by compassion in the face of fear. And true justice belongs not to leaders, but to the people who demand it. So I ask you, when your community is under fire literally or figuratively, will you stay silent, or will you stand up and fight for what's right? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.